Now I'm going to hand straight over to my colleague, Nicholas Shaxson. So Nick's now going to open up an interview and question and answer session with the German economist, Peter Bofinger. So Nick, over to you.
Hi, thanks, John, and welcome everybody. So last year I was at a conference in Austin, Texas, where I heard Peter Bofinger give a keynote presentation about paying for the climate transition. And he was looking at the various different ways you might do it and looking at the pros and cons of each. And it really clarified a lot of things in my mind. Peter is I would say, probably Germany's best known economist, maybe former member of Germany's Council of Economic Experts, now a professor of monetary and international economics at the University of Würzburg. And I asked him to write something for us, which he kindly did. But I would like to. What he wrote for us was actually written before the COVID crisis emerged, and things have changed a lot since. So I want to first ask Peter, if you could just lay out your arguments that you made in Austin, Texas, then about the best way to pay for the climate transition. In your talk, one of the things that underlay the whole thing is this question that John mentioned at the very beginning: do economic justice and climate justice have to be opposed to each other? Do they, can you have climate justice and economic justice at the same time? And this is an absolutely crucial political question, because if we end up having a climate transition that costs so much that people on lower incomes are messed around yet again, it's going to discredit the whole thing. So it's an absolutely crucial question and underpins all the discussion we're having. So Peter, if I could ask you, just to start off with, just to look at your presentation and what your arguments were before the COVID-19 crisis about the best ways to pay for the climate transition. And later on, I'll come in with a question about whether and how your arguments may have changed or been modified by the crisis. So, Peter, can you hear me? I think he may have frozen.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I hope the internet connection. Maybe then I tried. Let me see. I put the camera off. Is it better now?
Sounds a little better, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that seems
No.
better. Yeah. You
can't hear me?
I can hear you okay.
Oh. What can we do?
Maybe you can't hear us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm away from home and the internet. I can hear you. Yeah.
Yes, it sounds more or less okay. It's a little bit, the connection's not fantastic, but we can hear you more or less. It sounded better when the camera came off.
Came off, yeah, okay. So I will try. I'm so sorry, I'm on the Canary Islands, far away from Germany and not in my normal environment. Okay, so I will try it and you give me a sign. If it's getting too bad, then I will repeat things. Okay, so the question is there a trade-off between climate justice and social justice? I would say it all depends on how you finance climate change. Climate change out of current revenue, or can you finance with debt? I think that's a crucial note. If you can't hear me.
We lost you briefly, but you're back again.
One option is that you give me a phone number and I call you.
Yeah.
I think it's probably worth doing, yes.
Whether there's a trade-off or not between climate.
Okay.
It's not better.
Let's try one more time, and if it doesn't work, we'll try with the phone number. If we can rustle one up.
So let's try again. So measures for climate policy. And if you want to finance climate policy out of current revenues, there's definitely a trade-off. That's why last year ago in Austin, I said, well, finance all the measures related to climate change with debt. And I think there's a quite obvious logic behind this. Have benefits for the next decades, for the future generations. There's absolutely no reason why all these measures should be paid by the current generations out of current revenue. And once you open the option of financing climate policy out of debt and deficit, the question is there any constraint for governments financing such measures? And I think the answer is relatively obvious, especially for large economies like the United States or large economic areas like the Euro area or the European Union. The answer is for such large economic entities, there is no financing constraint. And this is the key message of what is called modern monetary theory. This modern monetary theory is not so modern, it's just a kind of modern version of Keynesianism. And the modern element is that modern monetary theory discusses the way how governments finance.
I think I'm going to step in, Peter. We've lost sound again. Peter? Peter, I think we've lost sound again. Peter? Peter, can you hear me?
This is exactly.
Can we provide a phone number to Peter and he can call in?
Yeah, that's just been.
Very sorry.
Sorry about this, Peter. The sound has gone again. The sound has gone again. We're going to have to give you a phone number. So
I can't get better right now.
We lost sound.
I can hear you, but obviously you cannot.
We lost sound from about modern monetary theory. Okay, I think Peter is going to call in. Have we given him a phone number, Helena?
Yeah, it's just sent to him now. So
okay, all right.
Apologies for the technical difficulties.
So we are getting a couple of requests to ask Peter to start over when he switches the phone. What I suggest actually is, because at the moment he's talking about something that he wrote for us recently, I suggest that I just post on this chat the article that he wrote for us on tax justice focus, and then we can move into how his thinking may have changed since then. So if you excuse me while I just look this up. Apologies for the slight delay, but I guess the Canary Islands connection is not so good where he is. So. Second. Right. Sorry, it's just taking a little longer to find. Okay, here is the link that I shall post on the chat. So this article that he wrote was written before the climate transition.
Hi, can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, that sounds a lot better. That sounds a lot better.
I've moved outside, so maybe. So okay. So
okay.
I just try it again.
Yes, we had got as far as you just mentioned the word modern monetary theory, and then we lost you after that.
Yeah. So the idea is, if you say let's finance climate change out of government deficit and government debt, then you come to this kind of modern monetary theory, which says, well, there is no financing constraint for large economic entities like the United States or the euro area. And so I think this is exactly what we are experiencing today when governments are fighting the COVID crisis, and they use huge amounts of money to fight this crisis. The United States will have this year a deficit of almost 20%, which is really huge, and it's all financed by the Fed. The same thing that you can see with Japan, with the euro area. So this core idea of modern monetary theory, that there is no financing constraint for governments if the central bank finances it, is just what we can observe today. And the interesting question, of course, is if these large economic entities do not have a financing constraint, what is the constraint? And of course, the constraint is a real resource constraint that always exists. And so governments have to be careful if they generate funds from deficits and debt, that this does not lead to inflation. And this is a point which is made very explicitly by the proponents of modern monetary theory. That's what they definitively say. And now the question is, if we finance measures related to climate change, is there any risk of inflation involved with this? And I would say I don't see it. So especially if you promote renewable energies, you need less oil, and the oil price will go down. I think so. I think the oil price is a very important determinant of inflation, and so these measures related to climate change, I don't think that they would really could even have a kind of dampening effect on inflation. And the same thing, I think, a major area where we need measures to combat climate change is the ecological rebuilding of houses. So we waste a lot of energy with our houses, and if you make houses more climate efficient, then of course you need workers who do this. But I would say one of the consequences of the COVID crisis will be that there will be less demand for construction because you need less hotels, you need less office rooms. So this will have a negative effect on the demand for construction workers. And if we say, okay, we use the situation now for refurbishing, for making houses more climate efficient again, I think there's no inflation constraint. I think that's, I would say, the core view. No financing constraint. It makes sense that governments finance these measures with debt because they have a long-term effect. There's no need to finance it out of current revenue. And then I would say more or less this trade-off vanishes. One important point when we talk about financing climate change, there's of course the question: if you have taxes on carbon emissions, of course the government can raise money with that. But in this regard, I would say it's important that these funds that the government can raise, they cannot be used, in my view, for measures to fight climate change. They must be used for redistribution, because all these carbon taxes are regressive taxes. So the poorer people have to pay a larger proportion out of their income for these measures. And so I think, yes, we need high carbon taxes, but this money is not available for climate policy, I would say. Now I can hear you. I can't hear you now.
Sorry, I was on mute. That was my fault. Apologies. One of the things that's very salient in Germany, where you are and where I am as well, is a kind of mindset that is known as Schwarzer Null or Black Zero. And it has been a feature of the German political debate for many years, but it's also a feature of debate in other countries, maybe not quite as strongly as in Germany. And that is that we've got to have balanced budgets. We can't have budget deficits and borrowing. That's something that was very hard to crack before the crisis. I wonder if you could lay out, first of all, your views on that, where that logic came from, that logic of austerity, of we must have balanced budgets. where did it come from, both in Germany and internationally? And is the COVID crisis now changing this from a political perspective? Is the conversation changing, at least in Germany and internationally?
I would say it's both a German but also a global phenomenon, that government debt is regarded as something bad. And it's quite interesting. So I've just made on Twitter, and then may invite the audience to look on my Twitter account. I've made what I call Best of Menkyu series, and Gregory Menkyu has the most best-selling textbook on economics worldwide. 4 million books have been sold. And if you look at that textbook, which thousands, millions of students have read, it teaches the readers government debt has always a negative effect on domestic saving and domestic investment, and thus it reduces the growth rate of the economy. And this is there without any qualification. And the whole economic theory suffers from the problem that in economic theory, the standard economic theories, government deficits can only be used for government consumption. The idea that the government is an investor is not in the textbooks. And it's really amazing. And of course, then you might have this kind of negative effect on growth. But here the textbooks are a real problem because they shape the mindset of young people coming to the universities. And then once you have it in your mind, then you have the feeling, obviously, government debt is a bad thing. And of course, I think the negative image of government debt also fits in the neoliberal mindset, because it means if the government is not able to raise debt, it means the government cannot become active as an entrepreneur. The government cannot behave like corporations. Say, okay, there are fascinating investment opportunities, high-yielding investment opportunities. Return is much higher than the interest rate I have to pay. But with this black zero, with this balanced budget, which the government take away the government the possibility to become active in this regard. And of course, this is kind of this kind of pro-market, anti-government ideology. And for this, these balanced budget rules fit very nicely. And of course, the good news, I would say, at least in Germany, is that now the crisis, at least during the risk right now, has now I would say some kind of paradigm change. So the black zero is no longer, I would say, the holy grail of fiscal rectitude. And I think what's really kind of paradigm change is that now that the German government has agreed that the EU as an economic unit is able to raise debt in order to finance the economic transition after COVID. And I think that's a huge improvement. So the German finance minister speaks of a Hamiltonian moment that has taken place. And so there is some kind of hope that this taboo is no longer as dominant as it was for decades. That's the positive, the positive framing of this development. So there is signs of hope. I would not say that that this taboo is now vanished or is destroyed, but it has been considerably weakened, I would say.
So now in the context of the COVID crisis, I mean, you've spoken a little bit about how there are as long as there's not a real resource constraint, there's no real limits for large economies like the United States or European governments to borrow. Presumably there is some sort of limit somewhere. I mean, you said in your article, public debt's a bit like drinking. Excessive drinking is obviously bad. So what is the right amount? How do we know? How will we, can it just be unlimited? Are there limits? Where are the limits? How do we know what the warning signs are now that we are in a really, really new situation?
Yeah, so when I wrote an article for Social Europe on modern monetary theory, I quoted this word by Paracelsus, everything is poison, it depends on the dose. Yeah? And of course, that's the same thing with government debt. And I think what the proponents of modern monetary theory very explicitly say, of course, there is this real resource constraint. You have to be careful that government deficits do not lead to inflation. And therefore, I think if you want to, the warning signs are definitively, I would say it's a situation, it's price developments, it's inflation. I think can also, a very important indicator is the labor market. Once you see that the unemployment rate gets very, very low, that that companies are no longer able to find qualified people, then on the labor market, you will get then higher wages, and higher wages could then lead into inflation. So I would say an early warning indicator is the situation on the labor market. There are really shortages. Then via higher wages, that can translate into inflation. I think that's what happened in the 1970s in many economies, that the economic boom was so strong that together with the oil price increase, it ended up in inflation. But I think inflation and I think as a kind of early warning indicator, labor market conditions are relevant. But I would say in the current situation, and according to all forecasts for the next few years, I think we won't see excessive labor shortages that will lead to very strong wage increases. I fear it's just the opposite, that COVID will lead to unemployment, especially by lower skilled people working in the service sector, in services which will no longer in so much demand after COVID than they were in the pre-COVID period.
Okay, I do have a couple of questions of my own, but I do also want to, because time is limited, I do want to open up a little bit to the discussion in the chat that's coming up now. Before that, you mentioned a tweet that you had posted about Greg Mankiw, the sort of one of the sort of best known economics textbooks people. If you could, before you leave, put that tweet on the chat, that would be very interesting for us.
Just go on my Twitter account, and then you will find. I'm not such a hyperactive Twitter, so you'll find it very easily. And there's also I have also a summary of these best of Mankiws. But I thought it's really important to show the weaknesses of such a leading textbook, and also the bias that this textbook gives to young people, anti-government, pro-market, and it's really embarrassing. And if you just go on my Twitter account, you will find it easily.
Okay, thanks.
Of course, I'm happy for all kinds of new followers.
We've got a question here from Claudine Letzai, which opens the question of quantitative easing for the people. And I presume this means quantitative easing and then some sort of distribution to people, as in maybe a UBI, universal basic income principle. I'm assuming that's what the questioner means. Is that something that you would recommend from your perspective of monetary policy? Another part of the question is the debt jubilee across the world, in particular global South countries, would help in changing the way financing is done. And so I guess that's two questions, but what are your opinions on?
Start with the first, and then maybe you can just repeat the second. Yeah. So the first question is quantitative easing for the people. I think that's in fact what has happened in the United States in this year. I think most people did not observe this, but we had a fascinating, from economist point of view, situation that in the second quarter and third quarter 2020, the disposable income of US households was higher than in the first quarter before COVID, and then in 2019. So they had the highest disposable incomes in the second and third quarter of 2020. And that's due to the fact that the market incomes of people went down, of course, but the transfers were so huge that in some disposable incomes increased. And this was entirely, I would say, almost entirely financed by the Fed. So this was I think these were these rather generous unemployment benefits by the US administration. So that was a kind of quantitative easing helicopter thing, not directly from the central bank, but from the central bank via the government. And so that's what's happened. And well, I think whether you apply such measures, it really depends on the situation. I don't think it's as a general solution. I don't think it's a good idea. So it really depends on the dose and the diagnosis. And so I think it was, in my view, almost a little overdose, but the diagnosis was fine. So, but I'm not, to be open, I'm not somebody who likes basic universal income. I think what we need is of course something like that they have in Germany, that you have a basic subsistence financed by the government, but not unconditional, but conditional on the willingness of people to find jobs. If they don't find a job, they get it. If jobs are available for them, they are not entitled to this kind of basic income. And I think that's something which many countries don't have. They don't have basic income for people who want a job and don't get a job. I think that's something which we have in Germany, which I think is better than an unconditional basic income. So could you repeat the second question, please?
Yeah, well, just going back to the first question. I mean, we're going to hear later from Professor James Boyce and Jim Henry on a very specific proposal, which is ploughing either carbon taxes or the proceeds of auction permits back to people as universal income. That I think one of the strongest arguments for that is that it is the taxation of, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier, taxing carbon and not returning the proceeds to the people can be very unjust. It can put climate justice in conflict with economic justice. So would you oppose that as well, or is that a limited form?
No, I think obviously, if you have high carbon taxes and you do not redistribute the funds to the people, you get a lot of injustice because these carbon taxes have a very strong regressive nature. And that's why definitively you have to give it back, and then in kind of lump sum payments per capita. But that's what in Germany, we had several studies on climate policy last year. And there was a very strong consensus that if you do this, if you have carbon taxes, the proceeds must go back to the people. They're not available for the financing of climate change, because otherwise then you get this trade-off, which I think should be avoided and could be avoided.
Okay, so the second question, the second part of the question was about the debt jubilee, a forgiveness for lower income countries in the global south. Is that something that, the lower income countries have suffered horribly from the crisis, but they have in many cases lacked the means to pay to support their citizens who've lost their jobs and so on. So do you think this is a widespread debt forgiveness? Is this something, debt jubilee? Is this a way forward for lower income countries, or do you see other solutions in terms of the COVID crisis?
I think we definitely need grand designs to deal with the problems of emerging market economies and developing countries, because the fiscal space that is provided by that is proposed by modern monetary theory is only available for large countries that are able to have the debt in their own currency, where there is not the risk that as soon as you increase the money stock, all the money is flooding outside, which gives problems on the currency and so on. And so for the smaller and less developed countries, definitively we need solutions. And maybe we need some kind of Bretton Woods scheme, kind of broadly based framework to help these countries to recover from the crisis. Yep. So I think to leave them alone would be a disaster. And so hopefully the new US president will realize this, what a kind of Bretton Woods moment, which maybe would also include a kind of concerted global approach to climate change and the financing of climate change. But I think that's something which is definitely needed.
Okay, there's another question here from Ruth London. Does government borrowing really mean that later generations will pay? Or is it just a way of making flows of money fit with the needs for the flow of goods and services with nothing really lost even in the future? That's from Ruth in London.
So I would say, yes, they do not really have to pay it, because what matters is if the government raises debt today, it also issues bonds. And if the bonds remain within the country, they also remain within the hands of the future generations. So the future generations inherit the government debt, and they also inherit the government bonds. So they get both. Of course, the problem is that there is a distributional problem, that the government debt will be distributed quite equally, and the government bonds will be distributed not so equally. Yeah, and then of course it's a matter of distribution policy, of wealth taxes, of inheritance taxes, to get this transfer somehow in a kind of social way. Yeah, but it's true, the future generations, they earn both. as long as the country is not indebted outside with foreign creditors. Yeah? But as long as the debt remains inside the country, the future generations get both.
Okay. So I have quite a lot of questions in the Q&A now. One of them is from Nigel Munisami. How close are we to having MMT adopted? Yeah.
Yes, I would say what we are practicing is de facto MMT. I think there's a kind of institutional difference. So MMT would say that the central bank is more or less a part of the government, and that the government gets the money directly from the central bank. What we do today is that the governments issue bonds. The bonds are purchased by banks, but then they're immediately purchased by the central bank. So there's one intermediate step, and that makes it different. But and of course the central banks are independent in a sense, which does not fit in the pure MMT concept. But in this kind of emergency situation, I think it's more legal difference. From a functional perspective, I would say it is MMT.
Okay, and I want to go back to your point about US people, US incomes were higher than they were before the crisis started as a result of these transfers, which originated with the Fed. Do you think this is, I want to put a political gloss on this. Do you think this is one of the reasons why, I mean, many people were expecting Donald Trump to lose really badly in the election. Instead, he only lost with not such a large difference. Do you think this is one of the reasons for his, and maybe even the main reason why he didn't lose much more badly, given all the calamities that happened during his administration?
I think so. That was a very smart political economy measure, because it's really fascinating. You must look at these charts, and if somebody's interested, I've written a column on this in Social Europe, where they show the figures, and it's amazing. This increase in transfers is unprecedented in the US history. And what is also unprecedented is the increase in savings rate, yeah? And the increase in the money stock. So in these two quarters, second, third quarters, money stock, savings rate, transfers were unprecedented by any standard. It's really fascinating to see this, and I would say that was a smart way of the government trying to give the people as much money as possible to of course to win the approval. And astonishingly, it has not been, these developments have not been widely observed in the public debate. They're really unprecedented. Just repeat it.
One of the other questions, there's quite a lot of questions on the Q&A here. I mean, I think many of them you have answered already. One of the questions, though, that is also a theme of this whole event is the question of international justice. Lower income countries, of course, you touched on their own abilities to deal with this crisis from domestic resources. What do you think about the political possibility and maybe the best mechanisms, if it is possible or necessary, for international transfers? Some countries are suffering, the countries that are the least polluting in many cases, the weakest, poorest countries are the ones that are suffering the most, and the ones that are polluting the most are the ones that are finding it easiest to deal with the climate crisis and the COVID crisis. Is there a case for international transfers? Is this politically feasible? If so, what kind of mechanisms could you imagine?
Well, yeah, first of all, I think it's really a kind of Bretton Woods situation. So I think Bretton Woods agreements were discussed and made at the end of the Second World War, when of course the world was even in a much worse situation than it is now. But nevertheless, there was this feeling we're experiencing an extreme crisis, and in this extreme crisis, it's not a solution that each country tries to solve the problems by itself. We need a global grand design to deal with these problems. And I think that's what I'm talking of, a kind of Bretton Woods moment. And I think the managing director of the IMF, she has coined this word, Bretton Woods moment. And I think that's what is needed now, to say, okay, we have seen this COVID crisis. Our economies are more or less devastated. In addition, we have the huge challenge of climate change, and any idea to solve that each country is able to solve this by itself is absurd, and we only can do it together. And I think this feeling of urgency that obviously the countries had at the end of the Second World War, I think this feeling of urgency must be there, and I think it's not so difficult to have this feeling of emergency, and that's why, in my view, such a grand design is needed, and hopefully the new US president will realize it, and that's why I think it's so important to have a new president in the United States, because it's a major effort. I think also to get the Chinese on board might be difficult, but I think without such a major, strong effort, we won't get the global economy out of the devastation of COVID, and we won't be able to deal with climate change in an adequate way.
So kind of doubling down on that question about the idea of a new Bretton Woods, to what extent do you see, I mean, I have a question here from Danielle Campbell saying, how can the international community work towards a new Bretton Woods moment? Do you see this political will emerging? Do you see this as something that is possible? It's obviously a desirable idea, but do you see something that this could emerge in the next few? What kind of discussions are you seeing out there that give hope for this?
Well, I think that Biden has said, okay, the US will take over global leadership. I think that's a major difference now, and so I think if the US would take the initiative, I think all the other countries would be happy to join this, because yeah, it's so obvious that cooperation, coordination is required, and if the countries, if it was possible to share a sizable amount of countries under the leadership of the US, I think then also China might be willing to step in. I think the problem of Trump was he did the opposite thing, so he declared everybody as his enemy, and so China was able to increase its global leadership. But I think many countries would be happy maybe if this development could be stopped and a more multilateral approach could be adopted.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I want to just put a European focus on this because Europe is obviously a very important player in this game. Would you give a commentary on the general measures taken at a European level to combat the climate crisis in particular? I know it's all tangled up with the COVID crisis, but in terms of the scale of the ambition of what's been proposed in terms of the climate crisis and the mechanisms that are being proposed to finance them, is Europe doing enough, and what more does it need to do?
Well, I think it could do definitively more. I think they're always very smart in putting huge numbers on the table, huge hundreds and several hundreds of billions in programs, but very often it's just a redefinition of funds that are already there, and in some there is some more money there now, but I think it could be much more ambitious, but here the good news is what I said. We have this kind of Hamiltonian moment. It has now been acknowledged that the EU can raise debt on its own, and this has a positive advantage that it's not counted as a debt of the national member states. And some of them have debt ratios are very high, and so I think this has opened the door to a much more ambitious approach in climate policy than what was planned before COVID happened. So I think that's one of the positive elements of COVID, that this new financing mechanism has now been accepted, and once you have accepted it, you can also accept it for a second time. There are obviously no major legal problems with this mechanism.
Okay, that's kind of the end of my questions. I did want to offer you the opportunity. Is there anything else, any other questions you wish I'd asked, anything else you really want to say about all this, about financing of the climate transition before I hand over?
No, I think we have touched almost all the points, and I'm very happy that we managed it. It's my first garden Zoom.
The weather looks lovely over there. It's rather grey over here in Germany.
It's the Canary Islands, and so the weather is very nice, and so yeah, it's also kind of innovation that you can also do Zoom conferences in the garden. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry apologize for the technical problems, but it's the first day I'm here, and so I've not tested. I've had Microsoft Teams that worked, and another program that worked, but obviously Zoom is it's more difficult. But anyhow, I think we made
it worked out very well, I think. Thank you so much, and apologies to those who asked questions who didn't get the questions asked, but I think it's been a very informative session. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for bringing some Canary Islands sunshine to all of us, and I'll hand back over to John.